Can you talk more about the media in the book, the images, some of the graphics you had?
Thank you. So there are around 40 plus photos and images in the book. It's interesting. Beatles photography is very expensive. It's carefully guarded. The licensing on Beatles photography for even a small image can be in the hundreds of US dollars, even for a small, low publishing count book like mine. So I did rely on the good graces of people who I interviewed. The daughter of a wrestling photographer who happened to be at Maple Leaf Gardens in 1964 when the Beatles took the stage, let me use her dad's photos as long as I gave her copies of the book. Signed, of course. Others, it was dinner. Others, it was I had to listen to their Beatles stories for 6 hours. So there was a variety of wheeling and dealing. I paid for some, got some for nothing, some on a promise, some on future consideration. So that's how I was able to acquire. And there's some really cool photos. There's some photos never before been published in my book as well, which I'm very proud of. Think of it. No one's really written a book like this, so who's going to be looking for these photos, right? Except for me. All right. So now we're going to get into some individual stories. I mentioned the fella in Winnipeg when the Beatles had their fuel stop there on their way to San Francisco, okay? This young man was on his way to the beach. That's why he's in cut-off shorts and a beachy kind of shirt, right? He's on his way to the beach. He hears on the radio, the Beatles are stopping for fuel at Winnipeg Airport. Turns around, him and his buddies beeline to the airport. Security in 1963? I don't think so, right? So he's at the apron. He makes his way to the apron. The aircraft is a few hundred meters away. The Beatles had come down for a quick media scrum that lasted a few minutes. They go back up the air stairs. They're almost finished refueling, but the door is still open. He sees the door is still open. Pew! Dashes. Becomes known as Decker's Dash. It was the biggest and craziest decision of his life. He's in bare feet, barefoot Bruce Decker, dashing for those air stairs, gets to the top of the air stairs, pokes his head into the aircraft. Beatles are laughing their asses off because they'd heard all the commotion, right? And they thought, what is this guy doing here? Didn't take long before 1, 2, 3 Mounties grab poor Bruce Decker, barefoot and all, carry him out, doesn't get arrested. He's 15 years old. Leave the guy alone, right? But there's more to Bruce Decker's story. That's what my book does. I don't stop like a newspaper and say, please let him go, end of story. No. I looked into his life, and what a life. Bruce Decker became a member of the Guess Who. An original member of the Guess Who. With Burton and Randy and Cale. Maybe not Randy, but yeah, Burton for sure. He wrote a song with Burton Cummings. Bruce Decker decided that the indigenous history of Manitoba wasn't being well preserved enough. So he set out to manage the rebuilding of a major indigenous fort called Fort Gibraltar, which to this day stands as a park that holds the largest Western Canadian outdoor event every summer. He helped build it. But wait, there's more. Bruce Decker learns that pre-Confederation, there are images of our country, backwoods images, lumbering, forestry, farming, taken not with modern cameras, but with a method where glass was used as a transparency. There was a chemical brew put on this glass, hidden from light, but once exposed to light, it would capture the image. And then somehow that chemical brew captured the image onto the glass, which was like a prehistoric negative, for lack of a better term, and you can get those printed. What does Bruce do? He learns the process. It's called the collodion process. He learns how to use it. And he prints for us some of the earliest images of our country. Now he's 39. Still living in Winnipeg. Goes to visit a friend of his in St. Boniface, Manitoba. Why? He just bought himself a new Gibson guitar. He wants to show it off. Because you remember, he was a member of the Guess Who. Still playing the guitar, still rocking, right? On his way home from his friend's house, the bus route required several buses for him to get home in Winnipeg. One of the bus routes was canceled. Out comes his thumb. Everyone hitchhiked in the 60s, right? Guy who picks him up is drunk, has 2 more passengers in the car. He's from Alberta, had been drinking all day. Police chase ensues. Bruce, the 2 passengers, die, age 39. The driver survives. That's the tale of Bruce Decker. And that's in my book. Pair of Saltzmans. What are the odds of 2 Canadians named Saltzman being intimately involved in the Beatles' history in 2 different decades? Well, they are. We'll start with Herschel Harry Saltzman. Herschel Harry Saltzman, born in Sherbrooke, Quebec, but raised in St. John, New Brunswick. Remember I said every province in this country is represented in my book at least once, in fact several times. Now we've got a New Brunswick connection. He leaves home to join the circus as a young man. That somehow leads to him getting a degree in economics in Paris and becoming a talent agent and then a film producer. But before all that, he served for the Canadian Armed Forces in World War II in a very clandestine way. He was seconded to what we think now as the precursor to the CIA, called the OAS, I believe you're called. Bill, did I get that right? Thank you. Seconded to the OAS, he's doing mind warfare, psychological warfare tactics during the war. Don't ask me what it was exactly. But you know who else was involved in the secrecy of the Second World War? The famous James Bond author. Anyone know who that is?
Doyle.
Yes.
Doyle?
Nope. You're thinking the other guy.
Sherlock Holmes.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
good point.
Who wrote James Bond?
Ian Fleming.
Thank you. There is a strong suggestion that our boy from St. John, New Brunswick was like this with Ian Fleming. Why? Because after the war, after he transitioned to all these different careers, he was a movie producer in London, England. He got the contract for the first half-dozen James Bond movies. Why is that in a book about the Beatles? Because he wasn't only making James Bond movies. He was making other movies, some pretty important movies from the early 60s as well. He gets a script for A Hard Day's Night on his desk. Hey, Harry, you ought to produce this. This band is going places. He takes one look at it and says, nah, I don't think so. A Canadian rejected the script to A Hard Day's Night, which became biggest grossing, most seminal movie of that year, and survives to this day very well, actually. Something else happened. Remember, he's got the James Bond franchise. The last one he did was Live and Let Die. This is when Sean Connery was replaced by Roger Moore as Agent 007. You remember the song Live and Let Die, right? Written by Paul and Linda McCartney. He didn't like Paul's voice. He gave it a listen. He says, no, we got to get someone else to sing it. Good song, but don't like this guy's voice. First he rejects A Hard Day's Night. Now he's rejecting Paul's voice. But by now, Paul's got a bit more influence. And Paul says, no, you're going to use my voice. And sure enough, Paul's voice and the song won not only a Grammy, but also a second award that year. So 2 awards for the movie. So it was good that he acquiesced on that latter part. The other Saltzman I mentioned is Paul Saltzman. This is the lovelorn fella who was in India when his girlfriend broke up with him. He ended up meditating with the Beatles and spending a considerable amount of very intimate time with them. Became quite friendly, and to this day has done so much with that experience that has pretty much defined his career. He's also won Emmy Awards for the movies he's made. So 2 Saltzmans, 1 country. Lillian Shirt. I mentioned I have 3 indigenous stories in my book. This is perhaps the most profound. Anyone ever heard of Lillian Shirt? No? From the Saddle Lake Cree Nation in northern Alberta. In 1969, she was an activist. She was protesting the living conditions of our indigenous people on the steps of the Alberta legislature in Edmonton. Who's in Canada in 1969? John Lennon. He's doing his Bed In for Peace in Montreal, right? There's two English language newspapers in the province of Quebec at the time, the Montreal Gazette and the Montreal Star. Only the Gazette survived to this day. And if you see it, it's about 8 pages thick. It's not very large anymore. Anyway, he's reading one of those two newspapers and reads about Lillian's protest on the steps of the Alberta legislature. Now John, he liked underdogs. He liked activism. He liked Abby Hoffman. John was very attracted to people who had that particular dynamic going on, right? Very attracted to shit disturbers, right? He wanted to learn more about her cause. So what he does is, he asks his people to call the radio station in Edmonton, go fetch Lillian, bring her back to the station so he can have a word with her, right? Are you with me so far? Okay. The radio station people are successful. They bring Lillian over to the radio station. John Lennon is on the phone. She doesn't know who John Lennon is. John's not about to explain himself, but what he does say is, I'm a pretty famous guy. If you've got a cause, I'd like to help get the word out to help your cause. She's still a little unsure what to say, so she decides instead to recite to him a prayer in Cree that her grandmother taught her. Right? This is spring of 1969. She decides to translate the Cree prayer. Imagine that if there was no hate. Imagine if we loved each other. We loved one another. Imagine that there would be no war between us. Sound familiar? It is entirely possible that a Cree from northern Alberta influenced John Lennon's most famous, most profound composition, Imagine, which he recorded about 18 months later. Think of that for a minute. Why write a book about the Beatles in Canada, you say? John asked her, can I use this? I like what you're saying, can I use it? She said, of course you can. Yoko, get me that pillowcase, I need something to write on. He writes this Imagine theme on a pillowcase. Imagine if someone had that. Imagine what it would be worth. Mull of Kintyre, a Paul McCartney composition, perhaps his biggest selling song of his life. It's a song about Scotland. It's very beautiful. It's got bagpipes in it. There is a strong Canadian connection to this song. So Paul has toured Canada more than any other Beatle, and he tends to play that song only when he's in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and England. And he asks local pipe and drum bands to play with him on stage for this song, Mull of Kintyre. In fact, he's asked 10 pipe and drum bands in 6 provinces to play with him. But nothing, no one, and nowhere more profound than what he did in Hamilton after the death of, thank you, Corporal Nathan Cirillo. One of the saddest stories in the history of our country. This was a young man, early 20s, guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier in Ottawa, when that radical, insane person shot him in cold blood. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Paul McCartney hears about it. And he asks Corporal Nathan Cirillo's regiment, who have a pipe and drum band, to play for him in Hamilton out of respect for our dead servicemen. And last, but now we're going to have some fun. That was too serious, right? Now we're going to have some fun. Do you recognize him?
Who's the other guy?
Marriage crunch.
No. Is that William Shatner? It is. That's Captain Kirk. That's William Shatner. And that's me. I met him. We actually, when I worked at Bombardier, we loaned him an aircraft to make a movie with, and he came back to thank us, and that's how I met him. In 1968, William Shatner decides to record an album. And he decides to act instead of sing. And so he acts his way through Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. But he thought, well, this is a song about drugs. Got to be about drugs. I'm going to pretend that I'm really high. I'm going to act my way as a stone singer through this song. It is one of the most terrible recordings ever in the history of mankind and womankind. It was so bad, that the American actor George Clooney said, This is a song I would bring if marooned on an island, because if you listen to it, you will hollow out your own leg and make a canoe out of it just to get off the island. Where was William Shatner born?
Montreal.
Montreal. Canadian, Canada, and the Beatles. Who am I? You know my name. I was born and raised in Ontario. I lived in Oakville for many, many years. I currently reside with my wife Tamara in Etobicoke. That's her. And I, at a McCartney concert, I am wearing my 2010 Aurelia Beatles Festival t-shirt. Aurelia had the largest Beatles festival in Canada for about 7 years. Unfortunately, they stopped doing it. My degree is in journalism. I went to high school at C.W. Jeffries with the great Mike Nicola, who's with us tonight. I've lived and worked in these places. I've lived and worked in Ontario, Saskatchewan, New Jersey, and Michigan, so I'm very well traveled as well. I had a 35-year career in journalism and in corporate communications, and when I was in corporate communications, one of my fondest colleagues to work with is at the back of the room, Sandy. Sandy, we worked.
John.
These are sample covers of the book. Before I chose to go with this cover, these were other ones that were presented to me. I think I made the right choice, although I gotta say, these are nice too, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not as good. I'd like to read yours.
Yeah, I'm kind of happy with the way I did it. I've been asked if I'm going to write another one, and I'm certainly, there's certainly enough incentive for me to, because since my book was published in late 2021, these 6 things have happened. With the pandemic not over, but with the pandemic certainly calmed down, you've got Paul and Ringo touring and releasing new material. I always find Canadian connections to these things. The album Revolver was remixed. Paul McCartney has written a book about his songwriting. The great 8-hour documentary, The Beatles Get Back. There's some cool Canadian connections to that. This is a film, Revival 69, Brian and I attended the premiere of in Toronto. It's all Canadian. That was all about a story that occurred in Toronto. And Mary McCartney, Paul's daughter, has also issued a short film called If These Walls Can Sing. So the thing about the Beatles is that it's a gift that keeps on giving. This is a band that is never going to leave our consciousness, never going to leave our pop culture ever. So there's always new things coming out. And now with their kids and their grandkids, and in the case of Ringo Starr, great-grandkids, there will be Beatles stories in perpetuity. Phil Pendry is with us tonight. Phil Pendry is also the next slide. Recognize? That's not you, Phil. That's you there. Phil Pendry is with us tonight. Lives in Toronto. He has Canadian citizenship. He was involved with Yoko Ono in her early days as an artist, including making one of her actually most famous films called Film Number 4, otherwise known as Bottoms. Phil photographed 365 close-ups of people's naked buttocks, and Yoko made a really interesting movie out of it. Believe me, it is not as nutty as it sounds. It's actually very interesting. It's considered high art in some circles. That's what that represents. But the cameraman who shot that and who helped conceive the idea is with us tonight. So should I write another book? Well, there's a lot of material that can come from this fella right here. These are some of the things he's done. He actually babysat for John and Yoko as well. He knew them, not only in London, but when he was working for the CBC's Asia Bureau in Tokyo, Japan, he needed a place to stay, to live, to go to work to his CBC offices there. He rented Yoko's apartment while he was there. So we have our Canadian and Yoko Ono and John Lennon, great connections. That is a beautiful Jaguar Series 2, and that is a meter maid, otherwise known as a traffic warden in London. Do you remember meter maids? Remember the song Lovely Rita Meter Maid? It's a Beatles song. Phil videotape, geez. Filmed with 60mm film, these meter maids doing their work in London, and sent it off to his client, who was Radio Canada in Montreal. They put it to music, and they created what may be the first music video of a Beatles song. Now that's the man who shot it right here. So yeah, maybe I will write another book. Where can you get my book? Website, and all of these online vendors, they all have it. Do you know how pricing works with Amazon and these guys? They call it dynamic pricing. It means you can pay $23, you might pay $19, but you might pay $31. It all depends on the functioning of their algorithm. No one really understands it. They sure as hell do. And so I can't tell you what my book will cost if you buy it through these guys. Buy it through them, it's $24.99. Buy it through this place, it's delivered and signed for $35 anywhere in Canada, or tonight for $25 signed. Oh, I have a website as well, BeatlesInCanada.com. And that's it. Beatle blessings to you all. Thank you so much.